Hello, welcome to lesson 10.5. I've entitled this video, The Labor Movement. This video is going to cover pages 631 to 637. The Labor Movement. Before the Civil War, most factories were small and family-run. Bosses knew their workers by name and chatted with them about their families. Because most workers had skills that the factory needed, they could bargain with the boss for better wages. By the late 1800s, though, factories had changed and workers needed to adapt. Question 1. What were some of the main differences between the pre-Civil War factories and the factories of the late 1800s? Well, before the Civil War, most factories were small and family-run, and there was a personal relationship between the workers and the bosses. Therefore, the boss would be more inclined to give their workers an increase in pay because they knew they had families and they knew their background and their story. And when you have a personal connection like that, you're more likely going to give someone a raise. In the late 1800s, though, because the factories were larger and more impersonal, bosses didn't know the workers by name, and also the skills were less important because the workers basically were running machines, and the bosses could fire any worker and replace them very quickly since they were running a machine. And with the mass amounts of immigration coming to America, there were always workers that were wanting a job. So workers were very replaceable, unfortunately, for the workers in the late 1800s. How did working conditions change in the late 1800s? By the 1880s, the relationship between worker and boss had changed. People worked all day tending machines in a large, crowded, noisy room. Because their skills were easily replaced, many workers were forced to work for low wages. In the garment trade and other industries, sweatshops became common. A sweatshop is a workplace where people labor long hours in poor conditions for low pay. Most sweatshop workers were young women or children. So question 2, why were many workers in factories forced to work for low wages in the 1880s? Because their skills were easily replaced by the many, many thousands of immigrants that were coming to America. So because they could be easily replaced, they couldn't complain or else they'd get fired and replaced with somebody else. Number 3, a sweatshop is a workplace where people work for long hours in poor conditions for low pay. Number 4, what type of people made up most of the workers in a sweatshop? They were either young women or children. Child labor. The 1900 census reported nearly 2 million children under age 15 at work throughout the country. Boys and girls labored in hazardous textile mills, tobacco factories, and garment sweatshops. In coal mines, they picked stones out of the coal for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Working children had little time for schooling. Lack of education reduced their chances of building better lives as adults. Question number 5. What did the 1900 census reveal about child labor in the United States? That there were nearly 2 million children under the age of 15 working in 1900. Question 6. What hours were child laborers working during the late 1800s? Well, they were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. So think about that. That's 72 hours a week. 6 days a week they're working that time. Think about how much you complain about what work you have, and then think, is life really that bad for us in 2019? Something to think about. Question number 7. While it was nice for the child laborers to be able to make some money, how was child labor holding them back? Well, because they were working so long, they had little or no time for schooling. And if you can't better your education, you can't advance your career path and get higher paying jobs that don't require as much time and commitment and hard work as the work they were doing, this manual labor work they were doing for low pay. A dangerous, unregulated workplace. Factories were filled with hazards. Lung-damaging dust filled the air of textile mills. Cave-ins and gas explosions plagued mines. In steel mills, vats of molten metal spilled without warning. Some workers developed long-term health problems. Others were severely injured or killed in industrial accidents. In just 1 year, 195 workers died in the steel mills of Pittsburgh. The federal government continued its hands-off policy toward business. Congress did little to regulate conditions in the workplace or otherwise ensure the safety of workers, even child laborers. So question number 8. Describe some of the dangers of the workplace in the late 1800s. Well, you had hazards such as lung-damaging dust, you had cave-ins, you had gas explosions, you had vats of molten metal spilling, you had long-term health problems, you had people getting injured on the workplace, you had industrial accidents, and there wasn't any health insurance back then to provide for you, or workplace laws to keep you safe, or so that you could like get money from your work if you did get hurt on the job. Those were unheard of back then. Question 9. One of the reasons they were unheard of: what policy did the federal government and Congress have toward workplace safety? A very hands-off policy. They made very few laws at all to regulate the conditions that workers had to deal with or to ensure that there was safety for workers. Now, that would change in the 20th century, but it would take workers a long time to fight for those rights to ensure that a workplace was safe. Why did workers organize unions? Many workers found ways to fight back. Some workers slowed their work pace. Others went on strike. Strikes were usually informal, organized by workers in individual factories. Sometimes workers banded together to win better conditions. However, most early efforts to form unions failed. So question number 10, were a couple ways that workers fought back against their employers? Well, some slowed their work pace, but many others, the most powerful tool they could do is go on strike, and then some tried to join unions. The Knights of Labor. In 1869, workers formed the Knights of Labor. At first, the union was open to skilled workers only. The members held meetings in secret because employers fired workers who joined unions. In 1879, the Knights of Labor elected Terence Powderly as their president. Powderly worked to strengthen the union by opening its membership to immigrants, African Americans, women, and unskilled workers. Powderly did not believe in strikes. Rather, he relied on rallies and meetings to win public support. Goals of the Knights included a shorter workday, an end to child labor, and equal pay for men and women. Most importantly, Powderly wanted workers and employers to share ownership and profits. Oh my. So let's move on to question 11. Early on, which workers could join the Knights of Labor? Skilled workers only. Question 12. Why did the Knights of Labor hold their meetings in secret? Because employers would fire workers who joined unions. You remember early in the year when Mary Driscoll was put on the list, if you will, and she was basically told, you can't work in our industry because your name has been put on the list. You are a troublemaker. So that's why the Knights of Labor held their meetings in secret. 13. How did Terence Powderly make the Knights of Labor more inclusive, meaning more people could join? Well, he opened its membership to immigrants, African Americans, women, and unskilled workers. So he was more inclusive, letting more people in, than exclusive, excluding people from joining. Number 14, instead of striking, what did Terence Powderly believe workers should do to achieve their goals? He believed on the strength of rallies and meetings to win public support rather than to lose support by going on strike. Question 15, what were the goals of the Knights of Labor under the leadership of Terence Powderly? Well, he wanted several things. Number 1, a shorter workday. Number 2, an end to child labor. Number 3, equal pay for men and women. And number 4, he wanted the workers and employers to share the ownership of the company or corporation and the profits. In 1885, some members of the Knights of Labor launched a strike that forced the Missouri Pacific Railroad to restore wages that it had previously cut. The Knights did not officially support the strike. Still, workers everywhere saw the strike as a victory for the Union. Membership soared to 700,000, including 60,000 African Americans. As this line graph shows, you can see the strength of the Knights of Labor dramatically shot up in that time period. So question number 16. After the Missouri Pacific Railroad strike of 1885 was successful, what happened to membership in the Knights of Labor? It shot up dramatically. How did the Haymarket riot hurt workers? The following year, the Knights of Labor ran into serious trouble. Workers at the McCormick Harvester Company in Chicago went on strike. Again, the Knights did not endorse the strike. Like many companies at the time, the McCormick Company hired strike breakers, or replacements for striking workers. On May 3, 1886, workers clashed with strike breakers outside the factory. Police opened fire and 4 workers were killed. The next day, thousands of workers gathered in Haymarket Square to protest the killings. The rally was led by anarchists, people who opposed all forms of organized government. Suddenly, a bomb exploded, killing 7 police officers. 8 anarchists were arrested for their part in the Haymarket riot, as the incident was called. No real evidence linked these men to the bombing, but 4 were tried, convicted, and hanged. A wave of anti-labor feelings swept the nation. Many Americans thought that the unions were controlled by anarchists. As a result, membership in the Knights of Labor dropped sharply. All right, we got a lot of questions to answer here. Number 17, what is a strikebreaker? A strikebreaker is a person who is hired to be a replacement for workers that are on strike. Sometimes they're called scab workers. Number 18, an anarchist. What is an anarchist? That is a person who opposes all forms of organized government. Question 19, describe the Haymarket riot. Well, you had some workers protesting what was going on, and then this rally was led by anarchists, and then somehow a bomb went off and it killed police officers. Well, Americans did not like that, so these anarchists were arrested for this bomb going off and killing these police officers, and even though there was no real evidence linking them to the bombing, 4 were actually tried and convicted and hanged, and as a result, Americans across the country said, ooh, well, labor unions equal violence, and violence bad, so labor unions bad. And so, of course, when that happened, question 20, how did the Haymarket riot affect the membership of the Knights of Labor? Their membership dropped sharply. A new union forms. Despite the failure of the Knights of Labor, the labor movement continued to grow. In 1886, an immigrant cigar maker named Samuel Gompers organized a new union in Columbus, Ohio. The American Federation of Labor, AFL, was open to skilled workers only. Workers did not join the AFL directly. Rather, they joined a trade union, a union of persons working in the same trade. For example, a typesetter joined a typesetters union. The union then joined the AFL. Thus, the AFL was a large organization made up of many unions. Unlike the Knights of Labor, the AFL stressed practical goals. It focused on higher wages, shorter hours, and improved working conditions. It led the fight for collective bargaining, the rights of unions to negotiate with management for workers as a group. The AFL also supported the use of strikes to achieve its goals. Question 21. What organization did Samuel Gompers organize in 1886? The AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Question 22. What type of workers did the AFL accept? Skilled workers only. Question 23. What is a trade union? That is a union of people working in the same trade. Question 24. The American Federation of Labor was a large organization made up of what? It was made up of many unions joining together to form one large group of many unions fighting for their goals. Question 25. What were 3 of the main goals that the AFL had for its workers? And these are goals that still American workers want today. Number 1, higher wages. Number 2, shorter hours. And number 3, better or improved working conditions. One more thing that the AFL wanted was collective bargaining. 26. What is collective bargaining? That is the right of unions to negotiate with management for workers as a group. Question 27. What did the AFL think about the use of striking? They believed that strikes were valuable and they did support strikes to achieve their goals. Its practical approach helped the AFL become the most powerful labor organization in the nation. Between 1886 and 1910, membership in the AFL swelled from 150,000 to more than 1.5 million. However, because African Americans, immigrants, and unskilled workers were barred from most trade unions, they could not join the AFL. 28. Between 1886 and 1910, what happened to the AFL's membership? It grew dramatically from 150,000 to over 1.5 million. Question 29. Which groups of people were not able to join the AFL? African Americans, immigrants, and unskilled workers. Women in the workplace. By 1890, 1 million women worked in American factories. In the textile mills of New England and the tobacco factories of the South, women made up the majority of workers. In New York City's garment industry, women outnumbered men. During the 1800s, some women formed their own unions. A few, like the Washerwomen's Association of Atlanta, which had all African American members, went out on strike for higher wages. None of these unions succeeded, however. Who was Mother Jones? The best-known woman in the labor movement was Irish-born Mary Harris Jones, known as Mother Jones. Jones devoted much of her adult life to the cause of workers. Jones spoke out about the hard lives of children in textile mills, quote, barefoot, reaching thin little hands into the machinery. By calling attention to such abuses, Mother Jones helped pave the way for reform. Question 30. In which industries did women make up the majority of the workers by 1890? They made up a majority of the work in textile mills in New England and tobacco factories of the South, especially in New York City's garment industry, making clothes. They definitely outnumbered men. Question 31. Which woman became the leading voice for women in the labor movement during that time period? Mother Jones. 32. How did Mother Jones fight for workers? She spoke out about the conditions that were going on at that time. She paved the way for changes or reform in the industry. Organizing garment workers. In 1900, garment workers organized the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or ILGWU. More than 20,000 women and men in the ILGWU walked off their jobs in 1909. After a few weeks, employers met union demands for better pay and shorter hours. The ILGWU became a key member of the AFL. Despite the efforts of the ILGWU and other labor groups, most women with factory jobs did not join unions. They continued to work long hours for low pay. Many labored under unsafe conditions. Then, a tragic event focused attention on the dangers faced by women workers. Question 33. What was the ILGWU? This was a group of workers, men and women, more than 20,000 strong, that organized in the garment industry, the people making clothing or textiles. Question 34. Despite the efforts of the ILGWU and other labor groups, what was life like for most women in the factory jobs at that time? Well, most of them continued to work long hours for low pay in unsafe conditions. The Triangle Fire. On a cool day in March 1911, the workday was just ending when a fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a sweatshop in New York City. Within minutes, the factory's upper stories were ablaze. Hundreds of workers raced for the exits, only to find them locked. The company had locked the doors to keep workers at their jobs. In their panic, workers ran headlong into the doors, blocking them with their bodies. Fire trucks arrived almost immediately, but their ladders could not reach the upper floors. One after another, workers tried desperately to escape the flames, jumped to their deaths. Question number 35. What was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory? This was a horrible situation that happened at a sweatshop in New York City in 1911, where a fire broke out and the people in the upper floors could not escape because the doors were locked. The ladders couldn't reach high enough. The hoses couldn't reach high enough, and so a lot of people died in this blaze. Primary source, New York Times, March 26, 1911. As I looked up, there at a window, a young man was helping girls to leap out. Suddenly, one of them put her arms around him and kissed him. Then he held her into space and dropped her. He jumped next. Thud. Dead. Thud. Dead. Nearly 150 people, mostly young women, lost their lives in the Triangle Fire. The deaths shocked the public. As a result, New York and other states approved new safety laws to help protect workers. So question 36. Why couldn't many of the workers of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory escape the fire that broke out there in March of 1911? Because the doors were locked from the outside and the people that had the keys had already left. Question 37. Why were the fire trucks unable to help much? Their ladders couldn't reach the top floors. Question 38. Why was the Triangle Fire an important yet tragic event in American history? Well, it shone a light on the dangers of workplaces where there weren't laws to protect the workers. So this led to reform. So that's the good thing. Unfortunately for the nearly 150 people, it cost them their lives. Labor faces challenges. The new era of industry led to vast economic growth. At the same time, it created economic strains. In the rush for profits, many industries expanded too fast. As goods flooded the market, prices dropped. To cut their losses, factory owners often fired workers. As the supply of goods fell, prices rose again. In turn, factories geared up again, and workers returned to their jobs. The economy swung wildly between good times and bad. These boom and bust cycles challenged labor. Between 1870 and 1900, 2 major depressions and 3 smaller recessions rocked the country. In such hard times, workers lost their jobs or faced pay cuts. So now we have a lot of questions on the law of supply and demand. Question 39. Due to the economic law of supply and demand, why did many industries try to expand? Well, they saw a chance to make a lot of money. Question 40. What happens when industries expand too quickly? Well, when industries expand too quickly, it means that they can't make money because there's too many goods in the market, so prices drop. Question 41. What do factory owners do when they need to reduce their losses from the prices dropping? Well, they often fire workers. Question 42. What happens because of the laws of supply and demand when the supply of goods fall? Well, when the supply of goods fall, then prices go back up. Question 43. Because of supply and demand, what do factory owners do when the prices of goods go back up? Then they hire back more workers. So those are several examples of the laws of supply and the law of supply and demand. Question 44. What impact did the boom and bust economy have on the American workers of that time period? Well, it was very hard for them. We had two major depressions, we had three smaller recessions, and so you never knew as a worker, am I going to be able to keep my job? Am I going to get paid the same? So it led to a lot of uncertainty for the average American worker. Strikes turned violent. After suffering several forced pay cuts, rail workers went on strike in 1877. Riots erupted as workers burned rail yards and destroyed track. Violent strikes also broke out in the West. In the 1870s, miners in Idaho tried to shut down two large mines. In 1893, after another bitter strike, miners formed the Western Federation of Miners. This union gained great strength in the Rocky Mountain states. Between 1894 and 1904, it organized strike after strike. Question 45. What sometimes happened during work strikes in the late 1800s? Well, sometimes they turned to violence, as people were very frustrated. Authorities act against unions. The federal and state governments usually sided with factory owners. Several presidents sent in troops to end strikes. Courts usually ruled against strikers too. In 1892, a Carnegie steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, cut wages. When the mill manager refused to bargain, the workers went on strike. The manager shut down the mill and called in a private army to end the Homestead strike. A deadly clash followed. The governor sent in the state militia to stop the violence. 4 months later, most of the men went back to work, but afterward, the mill prohibited unions. 46. Which side of the workplace did the federal government, state governments, the presidents, and other in the courts usually support? The bosses or the workers? They supported the bosses. 47. Describe the events of the Homestead strike. Well, the workers said, we're not going to take these cuts in wages. They went on strike. Then the manager shut down the mill. Then the manager called in a private army. And of course, violence ensued. And then the governor sent in the state militia to stop the violence. Now, many of the workers did get to be able to go back to work, but the mill said, no more unions. In 1894, a Chicago court dealt a serious blow to unions. A year earlier, George Pullman had cut the pay of workers at his railroad car factory. Yet, he did not reduce the rents he charged them for company-owned houses. Workers walked off the job in protest. A federal judge ordered the Pullman workers to end the strike. The strike leaders were jailed for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. This act had been meant to keep trust from limiting free trade. The courts, however, said that the strikers were limiting free trade. Oh my. Question 48. How was the Pullman strike a major defeat for the workers of America? Well, these workers were forced to still end their strike. Even though they were striking for the right reasons, the court said, nope, you have to end your strike. You are violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was actually created to stop monopolies, big businesses, from forcing their will onto the average American. And here, the courts were using the Sherman Antitrust Act to punish the workers, the very same people the Sherman Antitrust Act was trying to help. Gains and losses. Union workers staged thousands of strikes during the late 1800s. However, many Americans opposed the strikes. Some were afraid that unions were run by foreign-born radicals. Because unions were unpopular, owners felt free to try to crush them. Workers did make some gains. Overall, wages rose slightly between 1870 and 1900. Still, union growth was slow. In 1910, only 1 worker in 20 belonged to a union. That's 5%. Some 30 years would pass before large numbers of unskilled workers were able to join unions. Question 49. Why were many Americans opposed to strikes? Well, some Americans felt like strikes led to violence, and some believed that unions were controlled by foreign-born radicals. So the concept of striking and unions were distasteful to many Americans. And therefore, question 50, because unions were unpopular, what did owners feel free to do? Crush unions whenever they could, because they knew unions were not that popular in America. Well, thank you very much for watching. Before we go, I have a couple of striking signs I thought were funny. This one here, this is the last straw. I like that. And this one, I don't know what we're yelling about. Oh my. Well, thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.